Welcome to Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. Our podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? What can we learn from them? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
Well, welcome to part two of amusing perusings at this point, it seems, because every story Jonathan has is so interesting. But no, our Perusings, Appraisers on Purpose podcast is thrilled to have Jonathan Miller for part two. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's fun. It's great to be here.
This is fantastic. Again, I'm your host, Michael Hobbs here at Perusings, and we always appreciate the opportunity to hear from peers, whatever their journey has been and whatever journey will be, because it gives us insight, it gives us inspiration, it also gives us education. If nothing else, it lets us know that there are many other possibilities out there, maybe similar to what we're doing or maybe quite different. And Jonathan, you were just telling us at the end of the previous part one that you were in a courtroom, 5 perpendicular tables, nearly 10 people around every single table, it seemed.
Yep.
And you were there as a valuation expert, and you had spoken previously about the importance of neutrality. So were you on trial or were you just there as someone who was?
No, I wasn't on trial.
What case?
I was on trial. I've tried my whole life not to commit felonies. Like that's
good.
been a
That's
focus. No, but it's kind of cool because you're surrounded by like high priced legal talent, and then all the people that work for the Northern District of Illinois, they're all going to go on to be in private practice, mostly, highly compensated, highly successful, and they're very smart. And just to have the opportunity to chat with them, like
Yes.
I always said, like one of the problems of the appraisal industry is that I think when appraisers first start, they should be forced to testify.
Oh, that's
so they could see how the world interprets an untrained eye, like someone who's not an appraiser, they read your report and say, what are you talking? I don't even understand what you're talking. Like just to get that input, which is not the same as a reviewer looking at you. It's somebody that, lawyer or whatever, you're just sitting, you're like on your heels, right? Like, oh, don't ask, like all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, don't ask me about that. I didn't think of that. I didn't address that or whatever. And you pray they don't ask you that question, and they usually don't. That's why it's so fun to advise lawyers, for opposing testimony, where someone is just like, it's, the report is garbage or,
Yes.
It's never personal. Although, I am amazed, that, I remember I testified and it was just a condo, like a 2-bedroom condo in Manhattan. It was standard stuff. And I did an appraisal on a form, have addendum and pictures and floor plans, and the value is X.
Yes.
And the appraiser for the other side before me said that because I did it on a form, this is a condo, 2-bedroom, generic, like nothing special. And he was one that specialized in doing narratives of everything, right? So listen, I do narratives too, but on a 2-bedroom condo, individual unit, not the building, that feels like 75 pages feels unnecessary to me.
Yeah.
And he proceeded on stand to say that I was deliberately misleading the jury by doing it on a form.
Wow.
And my attorney said, how do you feel about that? And I said, well, there are some old guard appraisers left who believe in appraising by the pound.
Oh my gosh, I saw that coming.
Where like that's how I get a bigger fee is by putting 90 pages of boilerplate and 2 pages of content in a report. And the jury and the judge burst out laughing. Like it was like a total win. I'm not necessarily recommending that kind of, response, but the information, you want to be able to communicate clearly. and,
Yes.
what's the best way to do it?
That is absolutely phenomenal. So did you find, going back to, you had mentioned you all were focused in the market, had a relatively narrow geography. I mean,
Yeah.
still high density, but narrow geography. You're focused in a particular asset type. You grew obviously up until the market didn't allow you to grow anymore, and then you had to reverse grow, aka go from 35 down to 8. Now I'm sure you've been through some other cycles
Yeah.
since then. Where along the lines, and I apologize if you mentioned it, but where along the lines in this last, 45 years or so, 40 years, did you start writing the market reports? Because that creates a whole different awareness of you and your firm.
Yeah. Actually, it was initially problematic, and the reason for it is, so I consider myself a real estate appraiser and a market analyst. I'm not trained to be, a market analyst.
Yes.
It's just that I write about 150 market reports a year across the country, and they're used by the alphabet soup of agencies in Washington and the Fed. I'm on all kinds of economic advisory panels, the mayor's office in New York City and the New York State, and I do surveys for two Federal Reserve banks, and I'm interviewed for the Beige Book every 6 or 7 weeks whenever it comes out. And so what the market studies did was expose me to the world of economics.
Oh,
And market analysis is truly like the thing I have the most fun with. I love being able to tell the story of the market. And I remember, and so I've covered like Southern California, parts of Colorado, Texas. I do a lot of work in Florida these days, New York City Metro, Boston, and some others. I've done consulting for different MLS systems. Like, it just exposes you to other types of things.
yes.
But you're not valuing a specific property. You're valuing, or you're looking at the types of what the conditions in the market are doing to housing activity and why, and high end, low end, shift in the mix, and all that stuff, which I just think is really cool. I think in 2018, Columbia University here in New York took me out to lunch or dinner like 3 times, asking me if I wanted to teach a market analysis class at this grad program. And I remember saying, "You sure you have the right Jonathan Miller?" Like, I went to a college which I loved that invented chocolate cheese, and I feel like that's all you need to know. And they said, no. And so they had me guest lecture for a 3-hour class.
Okay.
And it was great. I loved it. And it was about 150, 175 students. And it was, on the Columbia campus in Manhattan. And it was just like amazing. And then I got a formal invite to teach a summer semester every year. And I've been doing it ever since. During the pandemic, I did it on Zoom.
Okay.
And they loaded up, like, the class size was bigger because they didn't need, it was like 190 students. Now it's like every year it's more like 125 to 150, somewhere in that range.
A lot of students in a classroom.
It is, but it's so cool because you're, I don't know if you noticed, but I can talk endlessly.
I had no sense of
my children and my wife remind me constantly, even though I deny it, but I can pretty much speak without a script for about 5 hours, and I start running out of my voice. 5 hours is my max. But I teach like 3-hour classes, and every summer, for the month of July into August, and it's super fun. And these students, I want to say kids, but they're in their like 23 to 30 years old.
Sure.
And they're super smart. They really are smart. Like to get into that school, they probably had a 4.0 average in high school. Like they were overachievers. And I almost brought this up earlier, but I remember when I taught that first class for 3 hours. And I remember one of the students, because one of my biggest things about market analysis is to understand, and appraisers run into this all the time, is often you have to find a proxy because the data doesn't exist, right? You just have to find something to say that seems like it would suggest that this trend is going to happen. The stock market, booms and there's going to be more equity drawdowns. And since wealthier people play in the stock market more than, working stiffs, then, it probably has a beneficial effect on more on the higher end than the lower. And like that's sort of a macro idea. So the student said to me, he really said it. He said, how can we be expected to analyze something when we can't find it on Google? And he was serious.
I appreciate his honesty
and kind of like sharp, and I said,
there was a team, they would say.
I said, well, this is something we call the real world. And the real world, not everything is in Google. And just because it's in Google doesn't mean it's right or insightful to the person you're doing the analysis to. And that was a really because, the Gen Z sort of world is millennial, then Gen Z is sort of like not, you don't interact personally, it's all like texting or, digital. And, many times like appraisers have to reach out to people directly and you find out a lot more than if you just were hiding behind, your chat.
Absolutely. I mean, what a difference that makes.
Yeah.
Be engaged with people.
Yeah. And also too, the rawness of teaching is that you are willing to speak to people and you don't have all the answers. Like I've learned a lot from my students that I hadn't thought about. And that just makes you sharper. It's like, writing a blog post or, writing a newsletter. It just makes you sharper. It's like you're doing your homework and then you're putting it out for public consumption. But the next time you speak in public as an appraiser brought into a sales office or, some event and you're speaking, you already know it. Like, like you've lived and breathed it, you've vetted it, you've talked to people about it, and you sound really sharp or smart about it. Well, guess who's going to get, the next inquiry or, appraisal recommendation or whatever, instead of like obsessing about USPAP or whatever, not that there's anything wrong with following USPAP, but I'm just saying like your expertise is like knowing everything there is to know about USPAP, but the consumer of your services 98% of the time could care less.
The market right now is tough for appraisal companies. Many companies are having a hard time getting enough work with the same marketing they used to. Is your company struggling, having a hard time getting new customers or getting additional work from existing customers? The answer to this problem is easier than you think. Do more business with the people you already know. Over 10 years, the average U.S. appraisal firm meets over 17,000 potential customers. That's a lot of people you could be doing business with right now. But it's a big problem if you don't have a proven process to communicate with them. StoryLux turns this problem into an opportunity to grow. Our advanced AI marketing tool can rebuild your contact lists and harvest long-forgotten communications. Imagine reaching out to everyone you've ever met with just one click. For the cost of 1 or 2 appraisals a month, StoryLux helps you reconnect and market to people who already know you, like you, trust you, and want to do business with you. Act now by contacting StoryLux today to turn your business growth dreams into reality. Email appraisal@storylux.com. That is appraisal at STORYLUX.com. And now back to part 2 of the episode.
That's such a great point. And you've touched on so many interesting things, which I appreciate you opening up and displaying for people, because, at some point or another, it's a possibility that people may have come across you on broadcast TV. They may have come across a reference to you in a well-known publication, business publication. They may have even, come across some of your blog posts or some of your newsletters, what have you. But it's another thing to understand that you too started out just doing valuation of assets. And what I heard you say is that you were intentional about keeping track of your data. And because you did that, you were more informed about not just micro activity, but also macro activity.
Right. And I think, what's that? The joke that an economist told me, the difference between a micro and a macro economist is a microeconomist is wrong about specific things, and a macroeconomist is wrong about things in general, right?
Yeah.
Because everything changes all the time, right? It's like, how do you think the market's going to play out this year? I can tell you, but 3 months from now, if mortgage rates spike or collapse or whatever, the outcome becomes completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So, you'll just qualify with, well, based on what we know now, then you can be a pundit or whatever. I just think appraisers are the best candidates to be pundits about housing market conditions, better than economists, honestly.
Absolutely.
Because you're dealing as an appraiser with actual tangible market conditions for a living. And appraisers, you're best positioned for that. Whereas an economist is like one step removed.
Yeah.
I'm not a trained economist. On my Twitter bio and other social bios, I call myself a non-economist.
I like that, non-economist.
But the idea is take your appraisal knowledge and then, it goes perfectly. Like market analysis is sort of just outside the realm of the valuation of the property. It just seems like a natural progression for people to do that. And I think, so many appraisers I run into in the profession, they're so smart and they could do that in 5 seconds, I think. And the trick is not to worry about being wrong, because it's an opinion and you're laying out why you think it is that way, why it's happening. Mm-hmm. A robot can tell you that the market went up, median price went up 7.2% year over year. But, an analyst can tell you a reasonable process of why it went up 7.2%. And the year before it only went up 1.3%, whatever. Like that's sort of my mantra.
No, I love that perspective. I've been a huge believer in that for a long time, because I didn't come to the appraisal profession like you. I didn't come into it because there was family or because someone guided me into it. I literally stumbled into it, and it's always impressed me that the people in the valuation profession doing appraisal, doing valuation, however you may see it, they do all this analysis and research. They are well informed, and they are in a great position to either make decisions, have choices, or provide guidance to others, not necessarily for a brokerage fee, but to make bigger decisions. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and in many ways, it's it's an important responsibility, sort of, in terms of, in theory, when you valued the property, you were cognizant of the world around it, right? Yes. And so all I'm saying is just articulate the world around it is I think the way. And really, when you think about market conditions, median price is the same metric in California, the same, as New York, and days on market. And, there's like 8 or 9 key metrics, and they all interact with each other, in terms of like telling the story. And that's all it is. Like, it's really not rocket science. It's really not.
I think that's such a great point and a valuable reminder of property is inside of some interaction of other activities,
Yeah.
and they're part of it's monetary. It's all ultimately some form of monetary. But as you said, it's about being a non-economist economist. And are you actually understanding the micro so you can get a sense of the macro? However
Right.
largely defined or narrowly defined that is, and then being able to draw conclusions from the data. It's not about, you've been in enough testimonies. I love well, based on my experience. I'm like, well, thank you so much.
Right.
But what does the data say?
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. I remember on a testimony, rarely I get to hear the other experts speak, and for whatever legal maneuvering. But this one time I did, and the appraiser on the stand was saying, because they were talking about highest and best use, and they were saying, well, in my legal opinion, I don't think that you're able to convert it to this. And the lawyer said, the judge said, are you a lawyer? And he said, no. And he said, well, why are you giving legal opinions? Right.
Exactly.
And then he did it again. He said, well, legally, I don't think you, and the judge said, now I just thought we understood each other. You're not a lawyer, so you can't give legal opinions. If you give one more legal opinion, I'm going to hold you in contempt, which basically means like overnight in jail.
Yes.
And he was really flustered because he was used to talking that way, and he's not a lawyer. So interesting. You speak to what your expertise and stick with it.
No, that's it's stick to what you know and don't get outside your guardrail, so to speak.
Right.
What given that your experience in the market, one that's been there for such a long period of time, you've had a unique opportunity to consult with so many firms. You mentioned that you're involved in one. As you look at the market now and you look at how it's going to expand, unfold, and evolve in ways that we don't even know necessarily, what are you optimistic or looking forward to over the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think sort of in a very macro generic thing to think about is we as appraisers are still living in a highly distorted housing market period. And I remember in early 23, a lot of media was asking me, what do you think about 2023? How's it going to be? How's it going to play out? And I dubbed 2023 at that time as the year of disappointment. And everybody kind of chuckles about it. It's like, yeah. And, not very optimistic, but, that's what I thought. And then in 2024, I was asked, what do you think? What do you think? And I said, well, I think 24 is going to be the year of less disappointment. And that was things are going to be a little bit better, but not great. And then, and now in 2025, it was like, what do you think? And I said, well, I think my first inclination was getting back to zero or, some kind of return to normalization, even though we don't know what normalization means. That's not catchy, but like the idea was, and so what I'm looking forward to, I'm hoping for is less sort of shock and awe about housing, because we've been going through these periods, these wild swings of feast and famine. The appraisal industry has been, along for the ride, and it's been a very difficult environment. We're going through, the last 3 years, we've gone through a massive uptick in mortgage rates. I believe it's the steepest ascent in history.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'd read initially it was the steepest in 50 years. And then I had read something later but whatever it is, it's not that mortgage rates are high. It's just, in context, they're double or triple what some people have, and a lot of people are. So we have the lock-in effect. We have all this stuff. And then at the same time, we're starting to see in the markets I cover, we're starting to see activity rise, even though mortgage rates are stuck, straddling 7%. And I think it's just time moves on. The person that bought the one-bedroom condo 3 years ago and the couple had triplets, and they're waiting for rates to come down. It's like, and those people are starting to buy if they can afford it, with the thinking that in 2 or 3 years maybe rates will be a little bit lower. There's no guarantee. It's a gamble, but sort of life moves on. And so you asked me what I was looking forward to. I'm looking forward to a much more dull and boring housing market, really, because my concern is the heavy volatility that we've seen in price swings and sales. Inventory is the most important metric in residential housing today. It's what's distorting everything. That, I worry about upcoming generations are going to be terrified, of home ownership, and I don't know if that's good or bad. I just know I was brought up on that, and my kids own houses. It's like I always thought of it as like a basic building block, and now it's like it's not so much a sure thing, and I just don't like to see that. So what I'm hoping is less drama.
That makes a lot of sense. When you look at your decades of experience around startups and so much technology, so much so that, you're back in the startup realm as well, more actively involved versus consulting. What are you looking forward to or eager about over the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
I don't know. The next good idea, is always all I need. That's what gets your sort of juices flowing, and you get excited about it, and you believe in something that no one's thought of before, and that is really kind of what it's all about. I don't have any specific I dabble in AI, and there's all kinds of technology sort of things you can hook yourself into and all that. It's not that, it's the idea itself and coming up with it. And so what's cool is, being pitched. I'm in my early 60s, and I'm being, I've been pitched by people largely in their early 30s, which is really weird. I co-founded our company with my family when I was 25.
Okay.
So I was like a grizzled, seasoned veteran by 32.
Yes.
But they're starting with nothing, just an idea. And I've heard some really, really smart things that just weren't there. Mm-hmm. But just, my goal in life is to be in the room, when cool things happen, to be in the room. And there's nothing cooler than, I have my memory of Trulia, and I have some other things that I've been involved in, but beyond that, I'm not really.
Got it. Love
it. Just a lot more writing, and I'm writing a book now, and
it's your bestseller.
Hopefully, not really doing it for that, but I want to entertain or whatever. It's sort of, we'll see, but. Anyway, it's not about appraisal theory, I promise.
Thank goodness. Well, in that case, you have at least a parting shot that it could go somewhere on a chart, as opposed to be a boat anchor,
right,
or a doorstop.
Absolutely. No. Well, it's funny because a book is your passport onto television. Mm-hmm. If you have a book,
yes,
that's what you need. And being in media is a lot easier when you have that. Not that that's why I'm doing it, but it'll be interesting to see how that changes.
Well, thank goodness for your striking good looks to get those additional televisions.
Listen, I have a face for radio. What can I say?
Well, congratulations for being able to communicate in multiple mediums.
Yes, it is fun.
Oh, that is indeed the case. Wonderful. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us, not just for one, but for two parts of such an engaging story. That's why we love Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose, because it gives us just a glimpse into all that's going on out there, some of which we can see because it's in the media, and others, as you touch on, we absolutely can't see. And until it's the generosity and the little bit of vulnerability to say, hey, here's some things that I did. Many of them worked, many of them didn't, but one thing led to another, most of which I couldn't control. And today, here's where I stand or sit.
Right. Yeah, no, what you're doing is really cool. I love the idea.
It came from you, buddy. You told me to do this a long time ago, and I did.
Well, listen, any venue where I get to talk for like a couple of hours, like unabated, like it's a win. Like I'm in.
Get it. Totally get it. Absolutely love it. Friends, I know you love it too. Be generous, be thoughtful. And as you're heading into your continuing education courses, people, hey, what do you listen to or what are you paying attention to? Let them know it's definitely this podcast, and they can jump in and subscribe as well. Jonathan, thank you again.
You bet. Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing professional paths and achievements of our beloved guests. Before we go, please subscribe on your listening channel, Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. After you drop a comment below, who is one friend and peer you can generously share this episode with? If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.